Hi everyone, welcome back to our channel. Bex here today to talk about some BookTube prize reads. I participated in the nonfiction semifinals that happened in June and July, so I read the 6 books in Group A. If you happen to have also read for Group A, let me know what you thought about the books down below. But I wanted to make this video so that I could review each of them and then also let you know my final rankings. So even if you aren't reading for the BookTube prize and you just have any one of these books on your radar, on your TBR, you can at least know what I thought about them. As I move myself over here to give space to put the picture of the book on the screen, shout out to my local library because I borrowed all 6 of these books from them, either as an audiobook, a physical book, or in one case an ebook, which is very rare for me. So yeah, shout out to them for helping me not spend money on books that I wasn't necessarily super interested in reading. I'm gonna start with talking about the number 6 book on my list, which is the lowest rated book of the bunch, and I'll work my way up to number 1. The first book on the list, but my least favorite of the reads, was A Fever in the Heartland, The Ku Klux Klan's Plot to Take Over America, and the Woman Who Stopped Them by Timothy Egan. I did listen to this one on audiobook, and Timothy also narrates. This covers the rise of the KKK in the 1920s in the US, with a lot of focus on the man D.C. Stevenson, who was sort of this person who really just lied about his past. Most people had no idea who he actually was, and he ended up finding his way into the KKK, rising through the ranks, and really built them up to be a big political threat. The book focuses a lot on what was going on in Indiana, because that was a stronghold for them at the time, but it does talk about how things were in the United States overall, and it is unsettling to read this and sort of see the parallels between what was going on then and what's going on now. But I do think that reading a book like this can be important because it teaches you what to look for, because history does repeat itself, but it doesn't always necessarily repeat itself in the exact same way. So something bad happening now probably happened 100 years ago, but it just might have looked a little different. And so you can pick up certain things from reading books like this, sort of understand the signs and know what to look for. So in that way, this book is really good. And it's just also good to understand the history if you're interested in it. My issue with this book really stems from the second half of the subtitle, which is the part that is, "And the Woman Who Stopped Them." I think this subtitle is a bit misleading. It implies that the woman they're talking about here, whose name is Madge Oberholzer, is going to be much more prevalent in the book, that she's going to really be taking the driver's seat on bringing down the KKK. And that's not really what happens. Madge Oberholzer finds herself associated with the KKK, not because she really believes in what they do, but just because of the political ties that they had at the time. And she ends up meeting D.C. Stevenson, and D.C. Stevenson assaults her. There's a lot of descriptions of violent racist acts in here, and the assault of Madge Oberholzer is also really laid out for you, so FYI. It's really through the help of her family and through the lawyers and the court system that she's able to take them down. Madge is not actively scheming. She's not going to the court trying to take these people down. It's other people around her that are helping her after she was attacked. And so she stopped them, but not in the way that I think the subtitle implies, and so I was a little irked by that. Madge Oberholzer also doesn't come into this story as a character until about halfway through this book. So you have to slog your way through some history, which is interesting, but also a lot of names and political maneuverings and whatnot, and that could be a bit of a drag at times. This is something that a lot of nonfiction books can suffer from. It's certainly not the thing that made me put it lowest on the list. It was more that subtitle, but there is a lot of names being thrown out here. And a lot of those names I didn't know, and so it became a bit annoying at times. There were points where I could feel myself zoning out a bit because I just didn't care with these names and the political maneuverings that were happening. There were definitely moments that were very engaging, but there was also a lot on the opposite side of that. And I also found that the narration by the author was not that good. He kind of slurs his words together sometimes, and I found the pacing at which he read to be awkward, and I didn't really think about it too much at first, but then as I kept listening to the book, I noticed it more and more to the point where it was really hindering my enjoyment at times. So I would not recommend the audiobook of this. Definitely pick up the ebook or the physical copy if you're interested in reading it, because I felt that the audiobook narration did take away a little bit from my experience. But the reason it is lowest down on this list, the reason I gave it 3 stars, is mostly because I do find the subtitle of the book misleading as to what this book is really going to be about. Number 5 in my rankings turned out to be King, The Life of Martin Luther King. This is written by Jonathan Eig. I'm trying to remember how they pronounced it in the audiobook. I don't recall. And then the narrator for this was Dion Graham. I really liked his narration. He has a wonderful voice. So that was definitely not a drawback with this book. This was one where I was definitely hesitant to read it because it's a very big book. The audiobook was over 21 hours long, and that's quite a commitment when it's something that you're really not interested in reading to begin with. I am obviously aware of Martin Luther King Jr. I know some of the history there, but this book is a very detailed look at his life. It utilizes a lot of sources that have not been utilized before. The author was able to dig into the archives and find sort of some long lost documents and interviews. He was able to get access to newly released FBI documents that other books that have been written about MLK didn't have access to at the time. There's even more FBI documents that are going to become available in a few years. So cue another person writing a biography about MLK at that time. But working with what he had, Jonathan follows King's life from where he was born up until his assassination, and a little bit after as well. But the focus is really on who Martin Luther King was. And at the end of the audiobook, there was an interview with the author where he said that the goal of this book for him was to show that Martin Luther King Jr. he's a human. He's a human being who makes mistakes. He's not this mythological figure that a lot of us have come to see him as, especially those of us who were born after he died, because he did face a lot of criticism and backlash at the time when he was alive. But of course, now the US has a holiday dedicated to him. He has a memorial in Washington, D.C. So the tides have shifted a bit on what people think about him now. But at the time, he was very polarizing. And I think my understanding of him was pretty surface level. I am aware of the Selma to Montgomery March. I was aware about his time in Birmingham jail, and also maybe the biggest thing, the March on Washington. But this book obviously covers way more than that, so I learned a lot about him growing up and kind of the education that he received, meeting Coretta, his wife. A lot of some of the things that kind of surprised me, especially later on, was how much work he wanted to do in the northern US regarding civil rights. And also how against the Vietnam War he was, which makes sense based on his nonviolent stance. I feel like I got to learn some new things that will actually stick in my brain and make me think about MLK in a little bit of a different light. With a book of this depth, we hear about all of the great things that he did, but we also get the not so flattering stuff. So I did learn that he had a habit of plagiarizing. Even when he was in school, he would borrow passages from different things and didn't necessarily get caught at the time. He only got caught later, maybe once he got famous enough and people were reading his works over, and probably even after he passed away, people going back looking at his work and realizing where he had borrowed passages, phrases from, and then also the amount of extramarital affairs that he was having. It was a little icky to hear sometimes how he would maybe talk to Coretta in front of other people. So those things did help humanize him. This book, I gave it solid 4 stars. I learned some things from it. I wish maybe it hadn't been quite so long just because I didn't want to read it in the first place. But if you are interested in reading a King biography, if this is something you've been thinking about, I can definitely recommend this. Number 4 on my list is Doppelganger, A Trip into the Mirror World by Naomi Klein. This is a book that I was aware of beforehand because I have seen people reading it and reviewing it on BookTube, so I was curious. Naomi Klein is an author who has documented politics and culture for many years. She's certainly well known in certain circles, depending on what sort of things you're interested in online, where you read your articles. She's written many books before. In fact, I realized after I was reading it that I actually have a Naomi Klein book on my shelves that I haven't read yet. So should probably check this out sooner rather than later. Yeah, so I was curious how she was going to take this idea of doppelgangers for this next book that she was writing, because her doppelganger that she's referring to is somebody else whose name is Naomi, but she has a very different last name, Wolf. But I guess they kind of exist in the same circles, at least they did at one point. Naomi Wolf is a well-known feminist, but she sort of took a turn towards the QAnon conspiracy theory, anti-vax stuff during COVID, and she was saying some very iffy things online, and that's when people started confusing the two of them. People were thinking it was Naomi Klein writing this stuff, and so that really made our Naomi, the author Naomi, think about doppelgangers. So she dives into that idea by looking at books and movies and whatnot throughout the years. The whole idea of the mirror world is sort of the world that those people that go online and dive into these deep conspiracy theories go, and people who kind of lose their family members to this mirror world can't pull them back. Those mirror world people are looking back at us thinking we're the dumb ones, we're the sheep who aren't paying attention to what's going on around us, and then we are obviously thinking the same about them. This book, I feel like it's a little hard for me to describe because it does jump around a lot. It talks about a lot of different things. Some things I found more interesting than others. I really liked this portion that she talked about Red Vienna, which I'd never heard of before. You can look it up, it's interesting. But Red Vienna, eugenics, disability, those are topics that I find interesting to read about. And so I liked that it showed up in her book. But there were other passages where I feel like things kind of went off in random directions and didn't quite tie back to what she was talking about. And so for that reason, it felt a little long, a little too disjointed for me to really like the book and love the book and rate it any higher than, an okay 4 stars. I think this one kind of slides in above King just because I was a little bit more interested in reading it in the first place, and there were certain topics of discussion that I was like, okay, I'm nodding my head, or just learning some random new things like Red Vienna. From what I've seen online, the reviews of this book are very mixed. So if you're interested in reading it, I would definitely listen to what a few different people have to say, and then hopefully you can get a better idea of whether or not you would like it. It's definitely not a bad book by any means. I rated it 4th on this list, but I just found that there was a lot of ideas being covered in here, and sometimes I felt like it went off in certain directions, and it didn't feel like it was staying on topic as well as it maybe could have. So number 3 was Eve, How the Female Body Drove 200 Million Years of Human Evolution by Kat Bohannon. This book was definitely slightly out of my comfort zone. It's a little more sciencey than what I tend to read, and it does, as the subtitle suggests, goes back 200 million years and looks at the evolution of certain things that we associate with the female sex. So there were a bunch of different chapters, and each chapter had a particular thing that it was focusing on. So I jotted down some of them. There was milk, perception, brain, menopause, those kinds of things. And not that perception and brain are specifically, a female sex thing, because males also experience that too. But it was sort of looking at it from the female lens. How would that be something that would be beneficial? And then also the author was looking at basically asking every time, what was the evolutionary purpose of this thing? How does it affect females? So I was like, okay, we'll see how this goes. I was curious how she was going to tackle this topic. The first thing that she looked at was milk, and she went back 200 million years to the eve of feeding your offspring through milk, and it was this little rat creature that existed during the Jurassic period. So I was like, oh, okay. I kind of see where we're going now. So before humans existed in any shape or form, we just moved through the timeline to talk about these different things. The very last chapter was a chapter called Love, and I did find that to be the most theoretical, and it was definitely a bit underwhelming. I do feel like the chapters got less strong as he went on, as there was less history and evidence to work with, and things maybe got a bit more theoretical, like the idea of love. It could be very science heavy at times, which is what I was worried about, but I do think the author balanced it pretty well with a more accessible writing style, and then also some mostly relevant anecdotes, personal little things. So she definitely tried to inject humor into it, so this is definitely a more of a popular science type of book. One of the things that I liked that she did address, because I was wondering how this was going to fit into the flow of the book, was talking about people who are transgender or intersex and what that sort of means, because she is talking about the female body. And so she does address those things where she might have a study about it, or a thought piece that she could reference. I did really like that she took the time to say that bodies shouldn't be boxed into the binary. It's much cooler for science when things can develop however they may. There's so much chance for cool, interesting things to happen. And so to just say it's either this or this is not very fun if you're in the science field. So I kind of felt that was a nice nod to people who have different bodies that don't necessarily fit into female and male. I do feel like I absorbed many interesting tidbits from this book, even though I was a little hesitant about it at first. And I do feel like it got a bit weaker as it went on, but especially towards the beginning, I was talking to a few different friends about tidbits that I was reading in this book. So I think that's got to count for something, right? So that's why this ended up in number 3. Number 2 on my list, this was definitely holding top spot for a bit until I finished the number 1. But number 2 for me was Wifedom, Mrs. Orwell's Invisible Life. This was written by Anna Funder. And I did end up listening to this one on audiobook, and there were 2 audiobook narrators. So Ariane Wynn Parks Lockwood and Jane Slavin, and they would go back and forth depending on if it was the author or Mrs. Orwell that we were kind of focusing on. So this author loves George Orwell. She has read his works many times, and she kind of realized that she didn't know much about Orwell's first wife. And this was spurred by the fact that there was a collection of letters that were rediscovered that Eileen, who was Orwell's wife, sent to her friend Nora. And this sent our author on a search down a rabbit hole about Eileen O'Shaughnessy, George Orwell's first wife. This book is interesting because it's a bit of a mix between fiction and nonfiction. It uses letters and interviews and other research to build out who Eileen was and who she was related to Orwell, who she was related to her family, to herself, and her own ambitions and desires. The author talks about how she ended up here writing about this, but then it also has breaks in the book that are imagined from Eileen's point of view. And I think this is where some people could really be turned off by it, because this is the author making assumptions about conversations or feelings that might not have necessarily been reflected in an actual primary source like a letter. I was aware of this book before I was assigned to read it. I'd heard at least one person talk about it favorably on BookTube, but I wasn't sure how interested I was, and it took me about 2 hours of the audiobook to get into it. The part that started to draw me in was when the author started talking about the idea of wifedom and what that means, and how wifedom would have looked in the 1930s and 40s when Eileen was married to Orwell, and also how that translates to today from the author's perspective, being a modern day wife. That's what pulled me in. And then as I started to learn more about Eileen, I started to like her a lot more. Orwell could definitely be an asshole at times, and it really seems like Eileen kind of sacrificed for him a lot. He definitely has to thank Eileen for her help with Animal Farm. It sounds like they really bounced ideas off of each other while writing that book, and that was a very, very big hit for him. I've read 2 Orwell books, 1984 and Animal Farm, and Eileen wrote a poem back in the day that says 1984 in it and kind of references a couple things that might have influenced Orwell when he wrote that book. So very interesting to note. I do think perhaps the author did go a little far sometimes, really took some artistic liberties with reimagining certain situations, conversations that would have happened. I did notice that in the reviews on Goodreads after I finished it that people were sort of saying, you know, I don't know if this conclusion was necessarily correct. You know, if you go to Wikipedia, there's definitely some things saying, you know, maybe I don't think she necessarily interpreted this correctly, like based on this other piece of work. So there's maybe a little bit of contention, some of the information that's in there, but there are certain things that did seem pretty universally agreed on, like Eileen's participation in helping with Animal Farm. So I was like, okay, cool. And though I do think that maybe she overstepped it a little bit with her imaginings of these situations, I do think it helped to humanize everybody, including Orwell, because he definitely did not come off well most of the time. The saddest thing is that Eileen did die young, and it's really too bad because she seems like she was just a really like interesting, engaging, lovely person. It ended up really drawing me in, making me very attached to Eileen. That's why it gets to be number 2. But number 1 did this on a different level because I did not want to put this book down most of the time. Number 1 on my list is How to Save Babylon, a memoir by Safia Sinclair. This is the author's memoir about growing up in Jamaica and being raised by Rastafarian parents, particularly stricter Rastafarian parents, her father especially. Safia began her writing journey with poetry, and you can definitely tell based on how this book is written, because this memoir does follow her from a very young age to basically present day. It more or less follows a straight trajectory. It's pretty easy to understand what's going on, where you are in the story. She tells you a lot about herself and her family members, her siblings, mom, dad, and so you feel like you really understand the world that she lives in, even though it's a world that's completely different from mine. But that's also why I found it fascinating to read. I found myself staying up to read this book and read about the different situations that she was going through. Her father became stricter as she got older, and so there were definitely some very tense moments to read about, things that kind of made my heart start to race a little bit. It was sometimes a little scary to read because you didn't quite know how things were going to play out. This book wasn't perfect. It wasn't a 5-star read. There were a few instances where she would repeat who somebody was or repeat a situation, maybe to remind us, but I didn't feel like we needed reminding. She repeated the same thing 3 times within the first 100 pages, and I was kind of like, I know, I got it, it's okay. And I do feel like she spent a lot of time focused on when she was younger, and then when she was a bit older, there were some moments I felt like she skipped over them a bit, and I really would have liked more reflection on sort of maybe the like last third to last fourth of the book. So this is probably more like a 4.25 out of 5, but it's really well written. It's engaging. I didn't want to put it down a lot of the time. Very moving, and I would definitely highly recommend it. All right, those are my thoughts on the 6 books that I had to read for the BookTube Prize Nonfiction Semifinals Group A. If you have thoughts on any of these books, whether you've read them or not, leave them in the comments down below. Our links are also in the down bar if you need to get any of those. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you later.